All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session today. My name is Ida Alamayo, and I'm joined here today by my fellow colleague, Kirsten Keller. We are infection prevention and control trainers at the California Department of Public Health, Healthcare Associated Infections Program. We are here to discuss with you today the topic who, what, where, personal protective equipment in skilled nursing facilities. Today's webinar is being recorded. The recording and slides will be made available on our Project Firstline webpage at the end of the month. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. All participants will remain muted throughout the presentation. If you are calling in from a phone line today, please put in the chat box your name and email address. If you do not, you may not receive your certificate of attendance. I'll go ahead and put the call-in information in the chat again in case anybody has any audio issues during the presentation. Closed captioning and live transcript are available for this session. To enable, please click on the live transcript button on the bottom of your on the toolbar. We will have time for questions after the presentation. Please type your questions in the Q&A box at any time during the presentation, and they will be addressed at the end of the session. Additionally, you're able to type in your question in the chat box, and those will also be answered at the end of the session. All right, so this is a slide we're now showing in all of our courses to make ourselves aware of implicit bias. Implicit bias describes how our unconscious attitudes or judgments can influence our thoughts, our decisions, or our actions. This includes involuntary and unintentional perceptions made without us even being aware, and occurs as our brains sort information and perceive data to understand our world. Our implicit biases can affect our decisions, which can contribute to societal disparities. And being self-aware about our implicit biases, we can promote healthcare diversity and equality. You can learn more about your own implicit bias at Project Implicit at the website that is listed here. All right, and so now we'll jump into our presentation on personal protective equipment. All right, so many of you have seen this before. Infection prevention starts with you. You can see there are many opportunities for infection prevention. Infection prevention practices often stop the spread of disease and infection among residents. Standard precautions are the minimum infection prevention practices used for all resident care. Examples include hand hygiene, the proper use of PPE, and environmental cleaning and disinfection. You should follow standard precaution practices when performing activities such as bathing and dressing, perineal and urinary catheter care, oral care and feeding, linens and bed making, positioning residents in transfers, and skin, nail care, and shaving. By the end of this session, you will be able to describe how to select appropriate personal protective equipment, or PPE, discuss the consequences of incorrect PPE use, and review how to correctly put on or don and safely take off or doff PPE. When it comes to infection prevention, you could be wondering, why should appropriate PPE use matter to me? What's in it for me? Well, I don't know about you, but I don't want to leave work and come home to hug my family with residence germs on my scrub top or on my shoes, let alone get it into my car when I leave for the workday. By donning and doffing your PPE correctly, you reduce the risk of germs and illnesses from spreading to yourself, your family, your friends, your residents, your coworkers, your fellow CNA, and your community. By correctly donning and doffing PPE, you reduce the risk of contracting an illness or other nasty bugs like multiple drug-resistant organisms or MDROs. You also prevent the spread of those infections into your community and home. Each situation may require a different set of PPE. It is important to use the correct form of PPE in each scenario. You want to dress for success, to prevent infection and maintain safety for yourself and your residents. PPE includes gloves, gowns, face masks or respirators, goggles or face shields. One scenario you often encounter where you need a combination of PPE could be when caring for a resident with the flu. You want to make sure to wear gloves, a gown, and a face mask. Another scenario you could experience often could be when caring for a resident with a methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA. Make sure to wear a gown and gloves. So, how do you select the appropriate type of PPE? First, you want to consider the type of anticipated exposure. Will you be touching a contaminated surface while you're helping a resident sit up in bed? Is there a chance you might get spayed or splashed on by blood or germs that might penetrate the clothing while you're assisting a resident in the restroom? PPE selection, in particular the combination of PPE, is also determined by isolation precaution status. This is where you consider the activity of daily living that will be performed. Think about whether you'll be shaving a resident who is known to suddenly cough, or if you'll be helping feed a resident who is bedridden and currently on transmission-based precautions. Then you'll want to ensure fit. When you don your face respirator or N95 mask, make sure you perform a seal check. For gloves, if your gloves are too small, you run the risk that they may tear. If they're too large, you're unable to perform your task adequately. If your gown is too big or too small, it can restrict your movement and lead to an increased exposure to germs. PPE must fit the individual user, and it is up to your facility to ensure that all PPE are available in sizes appropriate for you. We know your infection preventionist or your facility administrator already decided on the types of PPE to have in stock. However, your feedback is important if it doesn't seem acceptable or if it doesn't fit you correctly. You can let your infection preventionist know your issues, and they can ensure you get the right kind of PPE that fits. We understand CNAs have a lot to do, and sometimes performing your daily duties can be made difficult by having trouble accessing the correct tools. Or depending on the way your facility is set up, you may not be able to have quick, easy access to PPE, and you can't dress for success. For example, the German Shepherd in this slide might not have done a seal check on his mask. Notice how there is an open space between its mask and snout. The little guy in the middle here is probably wearing more PPE than he needs to be wearing, and his ears should be tucked away with the rest of his hair. The Boston Terrier on the far right doesn't have his nose covered with his mask and is allowing germs to enter his respiratory system. All right, so just go ahead and think to yourself, what are some barriers that prevent you from dressing for success? All right, so before we review the correct order to don and doff your PPE, let's review why the order in which you don and doff your PPE matters. At each step, we can prevent contamination of the PPE to prevent transmission of disease. For example, while donning gloves go on last after eye protection and masks because touching your hair or face with gloves on contaminates your gloves. Following a correct doffing procedure is especially crucial in prevention and control of infection. It is the most important step of preventing infection transmission. For doffing, the dirty gloves come off before touching your eye protection and mask because of the risk of contaminating your hair and face with your dirty gloves. The doffing of PPE should protect your clothing, skin, and mucous membranes from contamination. You don't want to risk being the host of an infection because your scrubs became wet with an unknown substance while you were removing PPE. Remember that all PPE is contaminated after use. PPE must be disposed of after use unless it's marked as reusable. And reusable PPE must be reprocessed before being used again. If at any point your gloves become contaminated, dispose of them, perform hand hygiene, and then replace them with new gloves. Always perform hand hygiene before donning PPE and at key points during the doffing process. All right, so before donning your PPE, perform hand hygiene with alcohol-based hand rub or ABHR. It is also appropriate to wash your hands with soap and water. Then you want to figure out what kind of PPE you'll need and to then gather it. After gathering your PPE, put on your gown. Tie all of the ties on the gown or snap all the buttons. The next step is to put on a NIOSH approved N95 respirator or face mask, depending on your type of anticipated exposure. Both your mouth and nose should be protected. Do not wear a respirator or face mask under your chin or store in scrubs pocket between residents. Step 5 is to put on a face shield or goggles. Face shield should provide full face coverage. Goggles are also acceptable. Finally, put on a pair of gloves. Gloves should cover your cuff or wrist of the gown. Healthcare personnel may now enter the resident room. All right, so more than one doffing method may be acceptable. Make sure you remain up to date with training and always follow your healthcare facility's procedure. The sequence for removing PPE is intended to limit opportunities for self-contamination. By removing the dirtiest items first, along with cleaning your hands in between steps, you can limit the opportunities for self-contamination. One commonly used method to remove PPE is to first remove gloves. The gloves are considered the most contaminated piece of PPE and are removed first. Make sure you do not contaminate your hands while removing your gloves. Removing your gown is the second step in PPE removal. If the gown cannot be safely removed while wearing a face shield or goggles, then you can remove your face shield or goggles before removing your gown. Some gown ties can be broken rather than untied, so do so in a gentle manner, avoiding a forceful movement. Reach up to the shoulders and carefully pull gown down and away from the body. And then throw your gown away in an appropriate trash container. At this time, you may now exit the resident room, perform hand hygiene. Remove your face shield or goggles. Carefully remove face shield or goggles and do not touch the front of the face shield or goggles. You'll then want to remove and discard your respirator or face mask, making sure you don't touch the front of the respirator or face mask. Perform hand hygiene again after removing the respirator or face mask and before putting it on again if your workplace is practicing reuse. For facilities implementing reuse or extended use of PPE during a critical shortage, you will need to adjust your donning and doffing procedures to accommodate those practices.
All right, well, Ida just covered a lot, so we're going to show you a short video that's putting together everything you just learned about donning and doffing. As mentioned before, there are a lot of variations in these techniques, and you're going to note that our previous graphics indicate to perform hand hygiene after doffing your gown and gloves. You're not going to see that in this video, but we do recommend doing so. All right, perform your beginning step. You're going to wash your hands, and alcohol-based hand rub is also acceptable to use. The equipment that you'll need to perform this procedure. You're going to need a gown, a mask or respirator, goggles or face shield, gloves, and then a trash container. Pick up the gown and allow it to unfold. Don't shake it, and you want to make sure that it doesn't touch the floor. You want to avoid contaminating it with anything that has germs on it, like the floor. Facing the back opening of the gown, you want to place your arms through each sleeve. Then you're going to fasten the neck opening. You're going to reach behind and pull the gown until it completely covers your clothing. And then secure the gown at the waist. And if your gowns have snaps, you want to make sure that each snap is secure and closed. Pick up the mask by the top strings or the elastic strap and pull the elastic strap over your head or ears, or tie the top strings first. Do not touch the mask where it touches your face, and pinch the metal strip at the top of the mask tightly around your nose so that it sits snug, and then fit the mask snugly around your face and below the chin. If your facility uses goggles, you want to place the goggles over your eyes or eyeglasses, and then use that headband or the earpieces to secure them over your head and make sure that they're on snug. Put on your gloves and make sure that the cuffs of the gloves overlap the cuffs of the gown. All right, she is ready to go. Now, when removing PPE, you remove the most contaminated piece of PPE to the least contaminated piece. So remove your gloves first. Touch only the outside of one glove, and with one gloved hand, grasp the other glove at the palm and carefully pull that glove off. Slip your fingers from your ungloved hand underneath the cuff of your remaining glove and remove the glove, turning it inside out, and discard. And then remove and discard your goggles. But if your facility uses reusable goggles, make sure you're familiar with your facility policy on what to do with those dirty goggles. Unfasten the gown at the waist and neck. Pull the gown away from your neck and shoulders, removing it without touching the outside of the gown. You want to avoid touching the outside of the gown because it is likely contaminated. Roll the dirty side in while holding the gown away from your body without touching the floor. Discard your gown in the proper container. Remove and discard your mask without touching the front of the mask. And then what is her ending step? Washing her hands. Good. All right. Before we move on to some specific points about PPE, let's do a skills check. A poll question is going to pop up on your screen, and please take a moment to answer this question. If at any point your gloves become contaminated while donning your PPE, what should you do? And again, some of these answers and questions might seem a little obvious, but we really want to reinforce these to you. If at any point your gloves become contaminated while donning your PPE, what should you do? Okay, I'm getting 100% so far. Give you guys about another 20, 30 seconds. Oh, I don't think we need to. Yeah, we got everybody. All right, yeah, exactly. The answer is A. You want to dispose of your gloves, perform hand hygiene, and then don a new pair of gloves. As mentioned earlier, gloves can become contaminated during donning by accidentally touching your hair or face, or if a curtain or a doorknob is handled prior to beginning resident care. Now, when it comes to the do's and don'ts of glove use, you do change your gloves between dirty and clean tasks with hand hygiene in between or between residents. For example, if you clear a resident's food tray from their table and then reposition another resident's remote, please make sure to first remove your dirty gloves, perform hand hygiene, don a new pair of gloves between assisting each resident. Do make sure you throw away your gloves in a trash can. We want to limit opportunities for touch contamination. Do not wash or reuse disposable gloves and never wear more than one pair of gloves. All right, last question, I promise. A poll question is going to pop up on your screen, and please select the right answer. What is the most important step to complete before donning and after doffing gloves? So before donning and after doffing your gloves, what is the most important step? All right, we're getting 100% so far. We have everybody participating really quickly today. Thank you. Let's see. Yeah, we got 100%. Hang on 1 second. There we go. Yeah, thank you. Hand hygiene. Remember to always perform hand hygiene before donning and after doffing your gloves. So this diagram illustrates the areas of PPE that are least and that are most likely to be contaminated. So areas of PPE that have not been in contact with infectious germs are considered clean. That would be the inside of your gown, the outside back, and the ties on the head and back are considered clean. Areas of PPE that have or are likely to have been in contact with body fluids, materials, or other environmental surfaces where there are infectious germs is considered contaminated or dirty. This includes those sleeves and the outside front of the gown. And as you can see in this image, the sleeves of the gown are dirty. When you are untying your gown, the dirty sleeves do not touch your face. Asking for assistance if available to observe or to help untie ties and watch for self-contamination is preferred to help keep you safe. Donning and doffing should be done carefully and deliberately when you, carefully and deliberately. And when you rush, you increase the likelihood that you're going to spread those germs. Now, I've done it, you've done it, Ida's done it. We've all made mistakes when using our PPE. Some common mistakes that you might have seen around your facility include double gloving and improper gown tying, not performing hand hygiene before putting on or after doffing your PPE, and maybe even masks not covering your nose or your mouth. When wearing PPE, make sure to wear only a single pair of gloves. Perform hand hygiene with either soap and water or ABHR before donning and after doffing PPE. And you want to ensure that your mask is covering both your nose and your mouth. Also, if you always don and doff your PPE in the correct order, you won't have to worry about forgetting how to do it or worry about making a common mistake. There's less of a chance of doing something incorrectly if you always do it the same way. And if you're unsure of how to don and doff PPE correctly, you can ask your colleagues to review, see if they see any mistakes. And if you're not sure if you took off your PPE in the correct order, stop, perform hand hygiene, then continue doffing your PPE. All right, a quick highlight of today's session. To prevent the transmission of disease, it's important to remember the correct types of PPE to use in each scenario. The types of PPE include gowns, gloves, face masks or respirators, and face shield or goggles. Donning and doffing PPE in the correct order is important to prevent the transmission of disease. Also, we want to make sure that we perform hand hygiene before donning and after doffing that PPE. The CDC website has some excellent resources on proper donning and doffing, and you can also access any of these resources on our Project Firstline webpage.
All right, thank you, Kirsty, and thank you everyone for being here with us this afternoon. Everyone here will receive a post-training email with a short evaluation within a week after attending a training session. Please take some time to fill out the evaluation. You'll need to fill out that evaluation in order to receive your certificate of attendance. This entire process can take up to 7 to 10 days. For additional project Firstline information and to access our course content, please visit our website. I will go ahead and put that information in the chat now. All right, website information is in the chat. If you are joining today's webinar in a group, please note that you must be registered for today's webinar with a valid email address to receive a certificate of attendance. Also, if you are attending as a group today, please have your training coordinator send us a list of participants with email addresses at the end of the session to our Project Firstline email, which is also in the chat. In case, if any of the CNA do not have a valid email address as of now, please take some time and make one. There are lots of free options available online. Once the training coordinator sends the list, instructions will be emailed to each participant to register and be able to receive their certificate of attendance. The entire process can take 1 to 2 weeks, depending on when we receive contact information. All right, so thank you again to Kirsty for being here with me today and co-hosting, and thank you to everyone for attending our afternoon session. We now have some time to answer any questions you may have.
I saw a question, yeah.
So I saw a question in the chat. So someone asked, is performing hand hygiene okay with the gown still on?
Yeah, you can doff and re-don your gloves, but you do want to make sure to perform hand hygiene after you doff your soiled gloves and before donning your new gloves.
Great. All right, thank you, Kirsty. That was the only question I saw this afternoon. If you have any questions, please go ahead and add it either to the Q&A or the chat box. If there are no questions, this concludes our webinar this afternoon. If you do have additional questions that come up later today, later this week, whenever, please go ahead and email us at projectfirstline@cdph.ca.gov, or you can leave a voicemail at the number listed here. Just make sure to leave your name, contact information, and the question. And someone from our team will get back to you within 3 business days. All right, yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope you join us soon. At this time, this concludes our session for this afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
Next week, we are going to be going over environmental services and tasks that CNAs should perform.
That's it. Yes.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, everyone, have a good day.